last few years trying to help folks figure out how to meet all their physical space needs. And so we have a kind of a brief presentation here to go over the process, who are the likely people involved in that process, and then want to leave a fair amount of time at the end for discussion and questions from folks. So I'm going to hand it off and we'll introduce ourselves here.
Thanks, Mick. Hi folks, my name's Sean Cole. I'm a Senior Director with Curry & Brown, based here in Portland, from Wales originally, if you're trying to place the accent. It's not unusual for people not to understand me. So if that's the case, I'll try and pick it up in the audience and I'll talk a little bit slower, but this happens to me a lot, even though I've been here for 20 years. So I manage our tech and industrial sector based in Portland. I have a national role, and I'm very happy to be here today, so thank you for listening to us.
Fair warning, stay in the middle of the speakers. Come into the middle here.
Stay away from the speaker.
Save my ears there.
Want to make sure you're paying attention. That's
Right in the middle. There we go.
Next to Eric, is that work? Yeah. So, like Sean, I've been here about 20 years. You probably detect that I haven't got a Hillsborough accent at all. So, if you don't understand me, Sean will do the subtitles. But again, I'm a quantity surveyor. I'm a director with Curry & Brown. And work with these two fine gentlemen.
Fine gentlemen, I think that's a first for me. Again, Eric Myers, many of you might know me. Spent most of my life in construction and development. Most recently developing the two laboratory buildings on the east side, the East Side Innovation Hub and the NIR Center. So to kind of kick this off, a lot of people... Oh, yes. Actually, Sean will explain a little bit about Curry & Brown itself.
Okay, folks, so what we do, we're construction program and project managers. So essentially, think of, we help owners through the construction process from a commercial perspective. We look after your money from when you have an idea to when you go through design, when you go through construction and close out. So we're the people protecting your interests. So if you think that if I want to do a construction project, everyone will hire a designer because they want an expert to do it. They'll hire a contractor to go and deliver it. But a lot of people fall down in not hiring somebody to look after the money, while we focus on protecting you on the money side of it. And our value proposition is we typically save people 5 to 10 times our fee. So by looking after your best interest. That's kind of where we fit into the grand scheme of things.
And we probably didn't mention, but or if we did before, it's a 100-year-old company started in the United Kingdom, currently based out of the UAE, and we have a Portland office here. It's been here for 30 years, and we have about 25 folks working here out of the Portland office. Most of us are all out in Hillsborough, which is why you haven't seen us around downtown. Let me jump through here. So there's a lot of things that might lead you to the point where you need space. Most of you here are connected, obviously, with the OBI, so you might be leasing space here at OBI, you might be in temporary flex space at OHSU or some of the other universities, but sooner or later, if everything goes according to plan, you probably need more space. Some of the common situations that might lead you to that, obviously graduation tends to, as I've talked to tenants in the past here at the OBI, kind of sneaks up on you right when you least expect it maybe. And then, there's never a good time. I think one of the things that a lot of folks who aren't connected to the bioscience world don't think about how difficult it is to move processes. You can't just close down your laptop and pick up your beanbag chair and throw it in a new corner of a new office. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There's processes that have to be stopped and restarted. Oftentimes there's folks that work still at the university and still and then working as well in the private space that have to be considered. Sometimes there's licensing of your space that's necessary to coordinate. So it's much more complicated than the typical office user experiences. You know, you might be growing, the company might just be expanding, you just don't have enough physical space left. The OBI is limited, trying to fit as many companies as possible. Sometimes it can get a little cramped if everybody's growing all at once. So how do you deal with that, and how do you grow efficiently, both cost-wise and space-wise? And then sometimes your needs change. I've worked with a number of companies where just their processes have changed. They've moved to a different line of research that requires different space. They may move from something, you know, that's landing them more towards the chemistry side, so now they need chem hoods in their own individual space rather than using shared chem hoods. They might need to separate processes into separate rooms. That's just not capable of their current location. And a lot of times people, when they think about growing, they think in the number of labs they need or number of pieces of equipment that they need, and it's usually pretty easy, I found, for a lot of companies to articulate to me whether they are cramped or not in their current space. They also, you know, I get the question a lot, well, we're shoving desks together and we just don't have enough room, so we got like 8 desks shoved like in a hallway somewhere, so we just need more space for desks. Those are kind of the common things people think about. What people often don't think about, which is where specialists and consultants come in, is when you're thinking about new space, you need to understand all the implications of the work you do on how that relates to the space that you choose. That can be zoning. What does your HMIS report, your hazardous material schedule look like? Does that allow you to be in a B occupancy, which is a typical office type occupancy? Or is it pushing you into perhaps an F or H occupancy, in which case you would need different zoning than the general kind of office space zoning that most buildings that you find are in. What kind of lab work are you doing? Do you need chem hoods? Do you need 100% outside air? Can you utilize recycled air like most buildings do? That sometimes leads you to buildings that have specialized HVAC systems that aren't found in office buildings to allow you to do your work, and that would be very, very expensive to try and retrofit into a typical office building. Sometimes, you know, the things that I find end up being last on the list, regrettably, is where do all of your folks live that work at your office, and how are they going to get to work? Portland is becoming more and more a difficult city to commute in, and we're starting to see mass transit being more and more used by folks, even folks that live out in the suburbs. And what's your timeline for growth? This is one that trips up a lot of folks. A lot of folks think, well, I can just find a space and move in, and I just kind of need to keep 3-4 months ahead of it. Most people are very surprised to learn that you probably need to be pulling the trigger on new space about 12 to 14 months before you actually need to move into that space. And then how are you going to pay for it? There's lots of different ways to pay for new space. It can be financed, through your company. It can be, paid for cash if you've got a big grant sitting there. You can perhaps be applying for grants, like through the HIOP program with Business Oregon. Sometimes you can ask your landlord to finance it for you, which they are willing to do, but it's probably not going to be super cheap. So when we talk about the project team and who is it that's going to be on your side helping accomplish this, it's actually a fairly large team. Most people start with the broker. We have some brokers here, so I won't beat them up too bad. The broker is going to be able to catalog for you what space is out there, and they're going to help you negotiate the initial terms for it. And I'll go through the compensation, everybody, so I'm not just picking on brokers, but brokers are compensated by the amount of your lease that you sign, and then they get that at closing or throughout the process of your tenure at the space. But it's usually included in the lease that you sign. The architect's going to design your space, and they are going to obtain your permit. So if you are even adding a wall, let's say a partition wall that doesn't even go up to the ceiling, you still have to get a building permit. if you are changing one door, you still have to get a building permit. A lot of people are really surprised what necessitates a building permit, and the city of Portland is all the time narrowing it down. I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the point where putting new carpet in requires a permit. So you're gonna need an architect, and there's a number of firms here in town that specialize in laboratory space. You want somebody who specializes in laboratory space and really understands the unique requirements around the fit and finish of your laboratory and office space, so that you don't wind up in something that just doesn't work for you once you get moved in. They are typically to negotiate fee up front, and they're somewhere usually around 4 to 6% of the project cost goes to the architect, and they're paid as they get their work done leading up to starting the project. So about 80% of their checks are already written before you even get to a permit. So the owner, that's you folks presumably. So a lot of folks are taken back a little bit, and I know some of you have probably been through a build out either in your personal life or professional life. And a lot of times people are very taken by surprise by how much time it takes. So, you know, all these different consultants and team members are looking to you to tell them, you know, where to go. How much space do you need? What kind of space do you want? Where do you want it to be? All of that expectation setting and planning is really kind of on your plate. In addition to that, you'll need to hire an attorney to negotiate the leasing contract. You'll need to negotiate the contract for the general contractor and the architect and all these folks. And this all tends to add up to what we figure for a TI in the 2,000 to 15,000 square foot range, about a third to a half of an FTE, a full-time employee. So we see a lot of clients actually hire this work out. There's a number of firms, Curry & Brown being one of them, that will staff your company with a project manager that specializes in this work and help through that procurement and project management side of things. The next is a general contractor. This is one most people think of. The general contractor is going to take whatever plans that your architect provides, price those plans, and then hire the subcontractors. They are their fee is based off of a percentage of the cost of work. So the more expensive your project, the more money they make. And then in addition to that 5%, there's usually another 10%, which we call general conditions, which is actually how all of their folks get paid. So that's what pays the salary of the superintendent and project manager and all of those folks. That's on top of that 5% fee. So then I'm going to have Sean or Mark, whoever wants to take it over.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, one of the things that we typically see fall down in the construction process is the misconception. Let's say you've got $1 million to spend. That's $1 million in construction. It's really about 70% is in construction, 30% is in your consultant team and your team. So it's really trying to help the owner walk into the deal understanding exactly what they need, how long it's going to take. So we would work with you to establish a realistic budget, share that with your design team so they can design to that number, and generally try and avoid surprises all the way through. Work with you to help select your architect, work with you to help select your general contractor, write the contract for you, negotiate, manage the project as it goes through construction, and then close out. So as I started before, it's really about looking after your commercial best interests. That's kind of where we fit in. The term quantity surveyor is kind of new to the US. All over Europe, all over the UK, all over APAC, but it's been coming into the US market in about the last 20 years. So it's really the commercial management of your project. Our fees are definitely on the low end. They would rise a little bit depending on the complexity of the project, but typically around about 1 to 2% of the construction cost.
So those are the team members that are typically going to be involved in the project, and I'll briefly kind of go through the process here, which may seem a little bit obvious, but I think it'll lead to some good discussion, hopefully. So the planning, like I said, I think the thing that people are most surprised by is that the planning for new space really needs to occur 12 to even 18 months prior to your move. And that's just really driven, especially here in Portland, by that permitting process. So by the time you find out how much space you need, whether working with a consultant or just inside your own company, you go out, work with a brokerage team to help find the right space, and then start working with an architect and contractor to design and build out that space. It takes some time. Sometimes the permitting process alone can be 6 months long. So being able to look that far into the future is really hard for clients. And I talk to a lot of clients that say, well, I don't really know how much space I'm going to need in 12 months. Okay, but are you going to need more space than you got right now? Because if the answer is yes, then you need to start thinking about it and starting the process and start working with the professionals necessary to kind of get you into that space. Just because you don't know exactly how much lab space you need when you start out doesn't mean that you don't start looking for it. The design phase, a lot of times clients will start with a QS or a lab planner. They'll start working with an architect to help define, okay, well, what kind of space do you need? And what I've found is so beneficial about starting with the QS and the architect is that most of the time clients that I've worked with in the past end up in about 75% of the space they thought they needed. They thought they needed 10,000 square feet, they end up getting them into 7,500. A really good quality architect and lab planner will actually find ways to make your space more efficient. And what people don't usually realize is that they may be cramped in the space they're in right now, but a lot of times that cramped nature is because it's not the right space. So being able to develop for you the right space will ultimately get you into a smaller space. That way when you then go out and hire the brokerage team to go find you that space, they're looking for exactly what you need, not something that kind of works or is generically working for everybody. And of course, shameless plug for ourselves, using a QS firm really helps you lead in with that target value design concept, where we're taking what the budget is, what is the operational budget that you can set aside for your space, whether it be the long-term lease rate and the TI, and we're helping drive all the consultants towards that eventual goal. So construction, a lot of times it's interesting. I talk to clients and they say, okay, well, I hired a broker and I got a general contractor and I'm going to start planning. That's great, but you're best off to actually hold off on the general contractor. And this is one that we find sometimes a little bit difficult for people to kind of wrap their head around, but you really don't need the general contractor until your plans are about 75% done. So that last stage before you go into construction or into construction documents that are going to be submitted for permit, that's when you go out and hire the contractor. And the reason is because that procures for you the ability to get a competitive bid. And in the marketplace right now, we're seeing a huge spread in bids between general contractors and especially subcontractors. So being able to go to them and say, okay, this is a real bona fide project, here's enough detail for you to give me a good price, and we know exactly or approximately when it's going to start so that they can go and select subcontractors who are going to have available time to work on the project. That will help you secure the best price for your build out. So once construction starts, that's when the real fun begins. That's when the general contractor starts sending 5, 10, 20 RFIs a day out to the owner and architect as they're digging through the plans and finding things that they still have questions for, which is totally normal, even in a very good set of drawings. They're going to start going out and trying to procure all the things that are in the drawings, and they're going to find the exact model number of the light fixtures and the carpet tile and the flooring and all that, and they're going to start submitting those to the owner and architect for final approval. This can end up being fairly time consuming for owners, and this is again where we see a lot of owners hire out this work to an owner's rep type of a person as we call it, a QS, who will help organize all of that project documentation and help smooth out the inflow of inflow of information and the decisions that come back out of the ownership team, and help reduce that burden for them. I can't really stress enough how much a project is benefited by taking a very proactive approach to project management on the owner's side. Nobody's going to look after your money as well as you look after your money. The general contractor is not going to look after your money. The architect's not going to look after your money. The people who care the most about your project getting done on time and on budget is you, or whoever you hire to represent you. And so by getting that team identified, whether it be staff inside your own company or staff that you're going to bring in from the outside, getting them identified early and getting a good plan together will help save you a lot of money and ensure the success of your project. So that's really what we had, and I would love to open it up for any questions that folks might have.
I have a question to one of your earliest remarks where you talked about H and I and F zoning. What
Oh, yes.
Abbreviations that I have no idea.
Yeah, so those are occupancy types. So in the building code, it takes everything. There's these giant tables that literally have every type of business you can imagine, from a pet store to a munitions factory, and they classify them in big buckets, and they're lettered. So A occupancies are usually things like an auditorium or a music venue, something that's got a lot of people in it. B occupancies are usually like offices or retail establishments, things like that. Then you get into some of the more specialized one, which is a lot of, in this room, the ones that are most relevant, which is F and H. And those are ones that have hazardous materials in them. And the size and quantity of hazardous materials, depending on the material that it is, can be as small as a soda can. You can have 8 ounces of something, and it pushes you from being in a B occupancy to an F and H occupancy. What matters most about that is that if the building itself, if the whole building was not designed for that occupancy type, it can be extremely expensive, or if not impossible, to change its occupancy type to what you need for your space. So a lot of times with tenants, what we'll start with is getting them in touch with a consultant that will go through an inventory of all their hazardous materials and the processes that they work with, and then identify what your amounts and number of chemicals and types of chemicals that you have in your lab, to define, okay, well, we can keep you in a B occupancy as long as you keep no more than X amount of these chemicals. Does that work for you? Is that something that's going to hinder your process?
Thank you.
Are prices negotiable, or is the way to control your budget by the quality and the scope of the materials you choose?
Well, everything's negotiable. Prices are somewhat negotiable, but it's not about whether or not you're going to get a piece of drywall or a 2x4 for less from one person to another. Mostly what we're seeing as negotiable is somebody thinks that it's going to take them 3 hours to put the 2x4 in, and somebody else comes by and thinks it only is going to take them an hour and a half. So a lot of the negotiation is actually working with the contractor and subcontractors around what is the most efficient way to get the work done, which then allows them to lower their price and be more competitive. So rather than just blindly going out, and when we go to procure something, instead of just sending it out to 5 people and then just taking whichever the lowest one that comes back is, we'll take those 5 bids, look at them carefully, interview the subcontractors, and level them. So we'll say, okay, well, everybody's got this material price, everybody's got this labor rate for this part of it, and this labor rate for that part of it. And then we'll go through and work with them if we think that they might have missed something that could help them lower their bid. And that's, so the negotiation process and in trying to get those bids lower sometimes does turn into the quality of materials. So they may have assumed that you wanted some particular floor covering, like let's say that they assumed that you needed welded seams in all spaces. Well, we don't need, and you said, well, per our type of systems and processes that we're dealing with, we don't need welded seams in the hallways. Okay, great, well then we can reduce that scope and save money there. So that's where the negotiation part of it has to be done with somebody who understands the process of construction to be able to find those little nuances to get the price down. Does that answer the question? Yes.
So I have actually two questions. The first one is, what's the typical tenant improvement rate per square foot? And then the other one is, we had a really difficult time finding buildings. Do you guys have an inventory of buildings that you can draw on where people can actually like move in pretty quickly and not have to deal with, landlord doesn't necessarily want a biotech company in their building?
Yes, so I can answer,
Yeah.
the first one is hard, what price per square foot? So I would say that it depends mostly on the building you're going into and how much is already there and whether that building was meant to be a bioscience building in the first place. So I've seen build out budgets in the $125 a square foot range that are very doable. I've also seen budgets where we're at $300 a square foot and we're desperately trying to make it work. And a lot of it depends on what are the base systems in that building and how it was constructed from the get-go. If you're going into a 1980s office building like this, you're probably in the higher end of that. If you're going into a building that was designed to be a bioscience building, then you're probably on the lower end of that. As far as an inventory of buildings, there are a few buildings around town that's been historically a big problem here in Portland, which is why when I was with Summit, we worked so hard to create the first two buildings. That the first is under construction right now on the Central East Side.
It's still fenced off.
Yes, it is still fenced off. They're boring micro piles in the basement right now. And then the second one is in design right now. Probably, I think the gentleman here, John, can answer best when that'll be built out. But those are the only two projects in Portland that are meant to be a bioscience building that are coming up right now. Everything else would have to be retrofitted into something, and then what we would do is look at an inventory of what available buildings are out there and try and grade them on the how easily they would be turned into a laboratory space.
What is the timeline for those two buildings? Do you know?
Well, NIR, the 10-story one that Eric mentioned earlier, so hopefully Q1, Q2 of 2022, but the smaller one, the 40,000 square foot one at 808 Southeast Alder, Q3 of this year, of 2020.
So we have flyers. I can leave them at the front
Yeah.
with our cards, and then we'll
Yes,
follow
and
up.
yeah. Any other questions?
Since they're here,
Yeah.
what is the estimated per square foot of the central research building?
Do you want to, so on 808, we're looking between $40 and $45 a square foot, and the 45 would be for the lab space. And then at NIR, it's gonna be, we haven't totally nailed down the number, but it's gonna be somewhere around that. And that's negotiable depending on where your TI comes in, and your term, and who's signing the lease. So it's a very flexible process in many ways. We do have a base condition, and you would build off of that. And like Eric had mentioned, the condition in both of these buildings is much further along than if you were to go, across the street to a standard office building.
And the term TI refers to tenant improvement, which is the work that's done to the building that, beyond what it is when you take it over.
Something that's unique about these buildings is they're built in a way that we can do multiple tenants on a floor. So you are not required, and we are not required to have a certain square footage. You can come to us and we can figure out kind of where to fit you. You don't have to take a whole floor or half floor. There's flexibility at this point.
Some of those nuances around, do you have to take a whole floor? Will the landlord, allow a bioscience building? That is really what the broker specializes in, being able to know. A lot of times brokers have a pretty extensive Rolodex of folks that they've worked with. A lot of the building owners and companies that manage buildings here in town, they'll know, well, we know that this type of landlord will probably be okay with it, we know this landlord won't be okay with it, and they really kind of help work with us on, okay, well, this is the things that, you know, from a building technical standpoint that we need, and they'll go, okay, well, here's the buildings that might meet those requirements.
You're also on the Portland IQ board. Beam Development has something going up in the ODOT blocks. I think one of their buildings is gonna be geared towards lab space as well. Is that, do you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah, so the ODOT blocks project is in design right now. You know, they're hoping to get into permit here pretty quickly, I think sometime this year. Their space, they do have space that they're qualifying as maker space. So certainly for anybody who's doing like small scale manufacturing, prototyping, anything that's kind of one of those like small scale industrial uses where you perhaps only need 2,000 square feet, 3,000 square feet, they are hoping to have their building online about the same time as the NIR building is coming online.
Can I ask where or what are the ODOT blocks?
The ODOT blocks, so the ODOT blocks, as we've always just referred to them in Portland, are a section of property that's adjacent to I-5. It's right on the centrally side, so when I-5 kind of comes off the Markham Bridge and goes down at the river level, there's these big parking lots on the east side. And those we just commonly refer to as the ODOT blocks because they were owned by ODOT when the Mount Hood Freeway was going to get built back in the 70s, I think. And they've just always been vacant because the state government has owned them. And they recently sold them to the city of Portland. And the city of Portland partnered with a private developer, Beam Development, to then redevelop them into essentially like affordable office space. And so they're working with them to try and deliver office space at a reasonable price, geared towards small startup companies.
Thank you.
I have a question in regards to when it comes to equipping the laboratory space. Like, what have you found for resources, like regional or local, for like used general lab equipment? Because I don't find a lot that's close by, and when it comes to like hoods or centrifuges, shipping them from the East Coast, where there's a lot of stuff, kind of adds a lot to the cost.
It does, and it's really hard to tell what you're getting and what the condition of it's going to be, and whether or not the shipping is going to affect it. And that is a really great question. There's not a lot here in Portland. There's more resources in Seattle, where there's a fair amount of lab turnover up there, and that is a fairly good resource. We don't have, like on the East Coast, there's a number of brokerage firms that just specialize in trading that and then certifying that. The best would be to work with some of the commissioning specialists. So there's a number of commissioning engineers here in the Pacific Northwest. They're national companies, but they have offices here in the Pacific Northwest. And they're the folks that would actually, bring the equipment in, set it up, and then certify it. They sometimes know where pieces of equipment are coming available and can get those from you. We have had pretty good luck working with VWR, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Also, Thermo Fisher has been very aggressive in trying to serve Portland as a market and is trying to help companies more and more. Yes.
Yeah, just in response to it, the Oregon Bioscience Association here with Contract, I think it's ALT, and they have used lab equipment. I haven't dug into the details on that, but happy to connect with you offline.
Great.
Any other questions?
Eric, I'm curious, did you survey the group ahead of time? Like, how many folks in here are looking to move into new space in the next 12 to 24 months?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, how many of you are looking to move into new space? 1, 2, 3?
Or do you count people who've already signed a lease and are building out their own space?
Sure.
We're doing that.
Cool. Great.
How much space for those who raise their hand are you looking to build out your approximately guess?
guys signed a lease, how many square feet are you building out?
5,000.
5,000? Nice. In downtown or? Oh, good.
Fourth and Harrison.
Oh, nice. Great. It's good to have people. I'm really glad you didn't say Vancouver.
It's got an advantage to it because it's zoned CX, so you can do whatever you want in CX zoning.
Yep.
Pretty cool.
Yep. Yes.
Maybe a little specific question, but when the Oregon Graduate Institute closed, they had a fairly new scientific building, 2 or 3 stories, very well built, fairly recent, and that was out the corner of Hillsborough and Beaverton. It never seemed to get a whole lot of interest, even though there was a shortage of biotech space. Is that because of some deficiency in the building, or that most companies want to stay in the central city?
So I did work with a number of companies, and I can't even count how many times I've toured that building. 2 things always came up. One was proximity. People didn't want to be out in Hillsborough. The second thing was it was designed for a single user. So it was designed for one large institutional user, and it wasn't really subdividable. So short of having a big institutional company come to town and just wanting to take it over, in which case a couple of companies actually did tour it and decided that they would have to, to make it work for them specifically, they would be better off just to demolish the thing and start over from scratch. The building, to me, was really a testament to how specialized life sciences is, and each tenant really needs their own space designed around their processes, and that we don't have really, big companies that can take a building that size. That was the main kind of problem. It also wasn't very efficient from a mechanical standpoint, so a few times that we ran some of the efficiency numbers on just operating costs, it was very expensive to operate. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys very much. You guys have anything else?
Oh, you're good, man.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you to Curry and Brown. Thank you, Eric and Sean and Mark, for being here today and for making this event happen. We really value your feedback, so if you would please fill out the survey and put it in that beautiful blue bowl at the front desk.